Who are you? Beneath the expectations, the labels, and the societal conditioning, what does it truly mean to become you? I'm John Fleming, the founder and lead practitioner of Becoming You. I created Becoming You out of a desire to share my own experience of becoming myself and to support others who are curious about who they are. From a young age, I have been driven by a desire to figure out who I am, why I'm here, and how I can belong while being myself. This is Becoming You, the podcast. Conversations about uncovering, embracing, and being your true self. A place where I dive deep into what it means and what is required to live life as your most authentic self. Through real, honest, and grounded conversations with professionals and people who are walking the path. If you're curious about identity, authenticity, and personal freedom, your own or others, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Luke, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my full title, I suppose, I'm Dr. Luke Beardon. I'm a senior lecturer in autism at Sheffield Hallam University's Autism Centre, which basically means I'm a course leader for a postgraduate certificate in autism that I run in collaboration with the National Autistic Society. Also teach on our Masters in Autism, and I'm a director of studies for a whole bunch of doctoral students. So that's basically what I do.
Nice, very good. You sound busy.
Very busy, always. Love being busy. Very stressed if for whatever reason I'm not.
Yes, I understand that. So Luke, before we get into talking about neurodiversity, I have a question from our last guest, which is, what has been the most pivotal moment in your life that allowed you to wake up, so to speak?
It's an amazing question. And there's loads of things, like I've got kids, I'm married, so you would sort of expect to go straight down that route. But actually, they came kind of later on in life. And I remember really, really clearly, as a kid, I did what I was told, at least I think I did. I always assumed that the grown-ups were right and that their way of doing things was the good way of doing things. And my mum particularly used to worry about me because I didn't have any friends, and she used to say, you need to get friends and you're going to be happier if you get friends and you need to make more of an effort, and like other people just stressed me out. So I was like, yeah, and I used to go and try and do all of this, and I think I was 11 years old, and it suddenly dawned on me that she was wrong. And it's the first time I've ever realized that somebody like in a position of responsibility like my mum, I could actually question her, and I think, no, actually, I know better. I'm all right without friends. I'm okay. I'm actually better off, in my view, without them. And I remember that was a real paradigm shift in my understanding of the world, that just because most people say things in this way and do things in that way doesn't automatically mean it's the best way for everybody. And that stayed with me for the rest of my life. And it's probably one of the fundamental reasons why I've ended up working in the field of kind of minority groups, I guess.
Wow, so at 11 you were already questioning normative behaviour.
And it was around that time also, I remember this, I'm sneaking an add-on. This isn't in answer to the previous guest's question as such, but I do remember listening to the radio, and it was about an altercation on a bus and two young people. And the person on the radio said, and it was two black youths. And I remember at the time saying, what's the relevance of them being black? And I remember going and asking a teacher and saying, why are they saying this? And again, that was one of those moments where I think I realized actually the world is really wonky. It's like, I just couldn't get it around my head. It's like, I don't understand what the point is. Why are you pointing this out? And actually to this day, so that was however old I am, like say over 40 years ago. And you'd get cancelled if you were a radio presenter and you mentioned the colour of somebody's skin that wasn't relevant. And yet we're still allowed to do that when it comes to autistic people. It drives me insane. You hear stories on the news say, oh, and so who was autistic. And you think, what's the relevance of that? That's literally just clickbait. It's not relevant to the news story at all. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry.
No, this is really useful. I mean, I think you're already highlighting the intersectionality of these things. And one of the guests on a previous episode is Viv Grant. I don't know if you know Viv. She does a lot of race work with school leaders in the UK. And we had a brilliant conversation about racialization, which I think is a really good example of what you just shared about. And I think that happens with other identity markers
like neurodiversity as well, where you get identified and nobody asks whether you want to be identified in that way or whether it's relevant. So I think it's really useful to be mentioning these things and bringing them into people's awareness. So, Luke, who are you and who have you been becoming in your life?
It's a really interesting one. Like you mentioned the word or the term identity. I think identity is a really odd one because people say, oh, like, what do you stand for? What's your place in life? People at work go, what's your legacy? What are you proud of? Pride is a weird one. Like, I don't understand pride at all. People say, oh, like I just mentioned, I was talking to you off air and saying, oh, I've just written a book and it'd be my 8th book. And people are like, oh my God, that's amazing. And I just think, not really. They're quite easy to write. For somebody else writing a book, and it's like their life's work and they've put an enormous amount of effort into it, be absolutely proud. For me, like I go out running and like I write the book in my head and then I just sit down and my brain just says, oh, here it is. So it's easy. So I'm not proud of it particularly. And it's kind of like, well, do you identify then kind of in terms of your life work? Or I don't really think of myself in that way. I think more outwardly than inwardly, I think. So I massively motivated. It's one of my anxieties in life that I'll wake up suddenly not motivated anymore, not motivated to go for a run or not motivated to write another book or not motivated to try and change the world of autism. Like that literally terrifies me. I have nightmares about it. And I love the fact that I'm hugely motivated and forward thinking in that sense. And I love the fact that so many autistic people, families and communities allow me into their lives and allow me to understand their identity. And then if I'm influential in their lives in a positive way, that just blows my mind. And that's just so humbling. But like the level of gratitude I have for being in a position to be able to influence somebody else's life for the better is just an extraordinary privilege. And I first started, I was age 14 as a volunteer at a school called the Windmill School, which is part of Addenbrooke's Hospital. It doesn't exist anymore. I used to go and volunteer for little kids, toddlers, who had the label of special needs, and a lot of those were autistic. And I just absolutely fell in love with these kids and their quirky behaviours. And like, I just felt so at home rolling around on the floor with them. And I still see myself as that 14-year-old volunteer. Like the fact that I happen to be a senior lecturer in my title, I still see myself as a combination of rolling around on the floor with those kids in what was called a special school and a grade 1 support worker in adult residential, which is my first kind of real job, if you like. So that's who I see myself as, I guess.
I'm noticing how important it is for you to feel connected to the people that you encounter, whether it's these kids rolling around on the floor or the families you mentioned, and the privilege of going into their lives and getting to be in contact with them.
Yeah, it's a massive privilege, a massive responsibility as well. Like, it amazes me when you come across professionals and you sort of think, do you realize how kind of lucky you are, or like what level of responsibility? Because what astonishes me, and this is of all ages really, but it really does blow my mind, the impact that a human being can have on another human being, even sometimes by accident, in the way that you talk or the way you engage with an individual. I've come up with what I call autistic courtesy, and I've been talking to a lot of people about it. And I'm one of the chapters in the book that I've just finished is all about. It's called autistic courtesy, and you can broaden it out to other marginalised groups actually, but neurodivergence in general. But obviously, my field is kind of autism centric, and the concept of autistic courtesy is that if you are autistic, and very often you have to spend your life, or if you're a parent of an autistic child, you have to spend your life saying, look, please, can you do this? Please, can you adjust this? Actually, the need is this. Actually, I might need things doing slightly differently. And it's only because the rest of the world isn't very autism friendly. It's not because you have needs over and above anybody else's. It's just that things are done for the mainstream population. So if you do things in a different way and you process information in a different way, you need to have a different system. But it's always that kind of asking and asking and asking, and the level of sometimes humiliation and self-esteem goes down, and all of those things. Autistic courtesy being, actually, if you can do that on behalf of somebody else, even maybe before you even meet them, and say, so students coming on my course, if I send you information and, I don't know, there's a screencast of me, so you know what I look like, you know what I sound like. And I've already said to you, look, come to my lectures, nobody's going to put a spotlight on you. There's not going to be any icebreakers. Nobody's even going to ask you to introduce yourself. You don't even have to talk. You can lie on the floor in the back of the room if that's what you want. You know, if you've got ADHD, you can wander around. All of these things, in terms of that courtesy, that I've done the best I can to think about what your needs are before you even need to ask. And the flip side of that is that people respond by saying, that's never happened to me before. And that just breaks my heart. It's like, you're an adult. Nobody has ever taken you as an individual into account before you having to ask. So I think we need to kind of flip the narrative, and rather than waiting and saying, oh, you know, what are reasonable adjustments? It's like, no, we should be doing all of this just as standard practice to make everybody feel included from the outset.
Yeah. Oh, I find this so enlivening to talk about, because I even had an interesting conversation recently with somebody where we were talking about the term reasonable adjustments. And one of the people I was having a conversation with works in a global corporate organization in diversity and inclusion. And she said, why are they even called reasonable? Like that means that there's some adjustments or accommodations that people might ask for that are deemed unreasonable. And why should somebody feeling included and safe and like they can have the best shot at something the same as everybody else, why would that ever be unreasonable? So it's even just things like, yeah, well-intentioned, maybe calling things reasonable adjustment policy or whatever, but actually the language in itself is so problematic because it reinforces normative ideals.
Yeah, and I love the Equality Act. I was lucky enough to be on the working party for the government for what was then the DDA, Disability Discrimination Act, that then morphed into the Equality Act. And in principle, it's absolutely spot on. It's like we want things to, there needs to be equity, not necessarily equality. So obviously they're different things. So having people's needs met as opposed to everything being the same for everybody. So in principle, it's absolutely brilliant. The fact that we've actually got to have it in the first place is that's soul destroying. The fact that we're not just doing these sorts of things anyway. And the other thing, just because it sort of pings around in my head, so often you'll go into an institution or organization, whatever, and go, look, this is what this individual is requesting. And the organization says, yeah, but you know, that's quite a big thing to do for one person. And you have to go back and say, you're not doing it for one person. You're doing it for every person that might need that from here on in. And that might be 1,000 people. You know, it's so closed-minded to go, right, today for that person, we need to do this. And some kind of like, that's the parameter. It's not finite. It's infinite. It goes on forever. Once you've made that adjustment, that change, it's changed. Job done. You never have to change it again. And actually, if you make things autism or neurodivergent friendly, then it makes it people friendly anyway. So why aren't we doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess this is what promotes masking, isn't it? Because if you've grown up in a world where it is so hard to have your needs met, it can be easy then to understand why people mask.
Yeah, so masking, for people who might not be familiar with it, and I find masking really interesting. It's a really useful term to explain my concept of Wittgenstein's line in application to the autism field. So when you explain, say I'm delivering training or speaking at a conference or whatever, you say, talk about people masking. And then people go, yeah, but, you know, we all do that a bit. Like, and it's true. Like people that, you know, that's why people say, I just really need time to kind of unwind and be myself. You know, that sort of concept. This is hugely, hugely problematic because, and this is where Wittgenstein's line comes in. So if Wittgenstein's line was here with us, and it became a threesome instead of a twosome, and the Wittgenstein would say, well, you know, if the line could speak, and we still wouldn't be able to understand each other because our life view is so completely different. Our parameters are so completely different that we might have the same language, but we would not have the same comprehension. Just literally wouldn't be able to understand each other. And I worry because the English language is very, very rich, but it's still limited. So the word masking, you apply that to anybody, they will have their own interpretation of it. The understanding then being within what I call the predominant neurotype, the non-autistic population, their understanding of masking, they will then apply and go, well, we're all a bit like that, and then assume that it's the same conceptual understanding or experience for the autistic person. So I always go back and say 3 questions, because I like things in sets of 3s. When you're masking, or what you think in terms of your understanding of masking, are you consciously aware that you're doing it all of the time? Does it take an enormous amount of effort and energy to actually do it? And are you exhausted as a result? And if the answer to those questions are no, and invariably they are no, That's not the same experience as autistic masking. That, you know, an autistic masking stems from essentially neuronormativity, which is kind of like the neuro equivalent of ethnocentricity, which is basically, here's a group of people that think they're better than everybody else. Basically, you know, there's a good way of being, and that not being like that, we need to fix you, we need to change you, we need to bring you more in line with us. And neuronormativity is essentially saying being autistic, being neurodivergent is a bad thing, you need fixing, you need to. And actually the world is full, absolutely full of neuronormative values that people are like, oh God, I would never be that discriminatory. And it's like, but yeah, in practice you are. When you say, oh, you know, you need to sit still because that's what we do. You're saying to the person who's got ADHD, your way of doing things is not good enough. You've got to conform to be a better human being, to be a better child in school. Don't ask such a ridiculous question. And what you mean is actually your way of understanding the world is not good enough. You need to conform. And what that essentially does is you are training young people that they're not good enough and they need to mask in order to conform. And now we know that there is a direct correlation between masking and increased risk of long-term trauma. Like, it is that debilitating. Yeah. Being forced to being somebody that you're not all the time can lead to trauma. So, and it's just denying individuals' authenticity. That's basically what it's doing. It's a pretty horrific thing to apply, but most people aren't aware that they're even doing it.
Yeah. It's connected, but maybe not directly related. But I'm curious to know what your thoughts are, because I'm quite skeptical about the roots of these things being wrapped up in colonialism and capitalism, because in a way, masking is a really good tool for capitalism, or at least that's how I see it. It makes capitalism work. It makes it more efficient. It makes it standardized because it makes people standardized. And that's what capitalism wants, because if we're all standardized, then we can be in some way similar and we can follow the same path in life, which is, you know, go to school, go to university, get a job, contribute to the economy. Do you see that masking and its roots are wrapped up in that?
I don't think it's as conscious. I don't think it's, generally speaking, as overtly discriminatory as it might sound. I think the repercussions of it are just as bad. And I think, like, certainly in my experience, when I teach people about masking and then teach people what it really means in terms of the autistic experience, and also what the subliminal or subconscious or actually overtly conscious message is to a human being, they're usually gobsmacked and devastated. And often it's like, oh my God. It's like, I feel like I'm not an imposter. I don't suffer from imposter syndrome. What I do suffer from is slight guilt. All I think I do is talk what I believe to be completely obvious common sense. And I sometimes get bewildered as to why the rest of the world doesn't already know it all. But I'm quite happy because I get paid to do a job to do exactly that. But it's like when you point out that you're not allowed, in inverted commas, to be autistic. You have to, as per the diagnostic criteria, you have to be diagnosed as having an autistic spectrum disorder. And when you point out, and people just go, oh yeah, no, that's what it is, ASD, this, ASD. You point out that every time you say that, that's a narrative microaggression to somebody. You are literally saying you're a disordered human being. That's literally what you're saying. You are actually saying you're a disordered human being. And all of your policies that say, oh, this is our policy for ASD, you are saying you are a disordered group of individuals. That is a microaggressive narrative. I genuinely think I might write my 9th book called maybe it'll just be a chapter rather than the actual title of the book, called Language Matters. Like, language really, really, really does matter, because the concepts behind it, if you get told constantly you're not good enough, you need to conform, you need to fit in terms of understanding of being autistic, you're impaired in this particular way. Basically, autistic people, this is tongue-in-cheek, are impaired non-autistic people. They make very poor non-autistic people, in the same way that non-autistic people are utterly useless autistic people. So why have we got this comparative model? You know, I don't look at my cat and go, you're a rubbish dog, or look at my dog and go, you're a rubbish cat. I go, no, you're a fantastic cat. You're a fantastic dog. I will understand you through a different lens, because you're a dog and you're a cat. Again, it goes down to that ethnocentricity, doesn't it? Or neuronormativity. It's like, oh no, there's a good way of being, in this case, you know, non-autistic. And actually, if you're not, then you're somehow impaired. People say, oh no, look, you're wrong, because autistic people they do lack social skills. You say, no, they don't. That's complete rubbish. They've got great social skills. They're just autistic social skills. Where are your good autistic social skills?
Yeah.
You know, when was the last time you sat next to an autistic person and just shut up and stopped talking complete nonsense? You know, that's a good non-autistic social skill, as opposed to apparently what you regard as amazing social skills. You sit in the pub and talk absolute nonsense to each other for 3 hours at a time, and you see that as a skill. That's bizarre.
Yeah, it all bleeds back into this idea of normativity, you know, about what's right, what's expected, what the standard we're all meant to be aiming for.
100%.
Yeah, and it suggests that we should all be the same, which, living in a world where diversity is so evident in so many aspects of the natural world, animals, that we wouldn't have diversity in the way humans are, the way humans think, is nonsense. It's like, why are we even having this conversation? That should be our kind of starting point, is of course there's going to be diversity.
Yeah, and also if everybody essentially thought in the same way, then originality would be very difficult to come across. And I really don't like, I find it very distasteful, the sort of us and them narrative, and one group is better than the other, and all. It's like, no, it's all part of natural variations of human diversity, exactly as you say. And actually, I think the juxtaposition of differing ways of cognition is more powerful than singular. It is the combination that makes humankind more powerful, I think. And actually, one without the other, or kind of the majority without the minority, is weaker than the combination of two. And as it would be the other way around as well. So I think that sooner there can be that kind of absolutely embracing of the correlation and the linking between different ways of thinking and appreciation, but actually allowing that authenticity as well, and understanding, no, actually, my way of doing things might fit me, but it doesn't necessarily fit you. So I'm going to quit going down that route of imposition. And that goes right across, you know, in terms of way in which we communicate, socialize, you know, kind of think, operate, our sensory systems, everything really.
You mentioned a while ago something about identifying as being autistic or being labelled as having ASD. Could you talk a little bit about person first and identity first language for people who might not understand that or get the nuance of it?
So person first language is person with autism. Identity first language is autistic person. There's been various surveys done with thousands and thousands of people, and the general consensus in terms of the outcomes of those surveys and actual research as well is that most autistic adults have a clear preference for identity first, so autistic person. Professionals tend to prefer a person first, which kind of annoys me because I think you should be listening to the autistic population, surely. And then there are some people who are like, I don't really care. But the rationale behind identity first is, look, being autistic is an intrinsic part of who you are. It's not an add-on. It's not a with. It's not a person then with something else. It's literally, people use the analogy of a stick of rockets. It literally goes through the core of who you are. You're never going to stop being autistic. You're never going to be less autistic or more autistic. It's just who you are, like fundamentally, intrinsically who you are. So that would be the rationale behind identity first. And when I first knowingly came into the field of autism professionally, I was told never use identity first. Actually, this is an interesting one. Never use identity first because it's seen as a negative. And actually that tells it all, because actually what we're essentially saying is being autistic is being negative. So referring to that individual intrinsically as autistic is actually a negative. Whereas the autistic population is saying, no, there's nothing wrong with us, mate. Yeah. Like, we're quite happy to be called autistic because that is who I am. So actually, I think learning from the autistic community, following the needs and the kind of wants of the autistic community is essential. So I flipped completely now and completely identity first all the way.
It reaffirms this idea that it's a neurotype and that it's connected to who you are, as opposed to pathologizing it into, this is a disorder, that there's something wrong with me that I need to work on in my lifetime, trying to fix or cure or get rid of.
And I don't know how long we've been talking, but people who know me will think it probably is a record that I've talked for this long without mentioning my self-professed golden equation. So being autistic only means you're autistic. Like, it's one of those things that if somebody remarks to somebody else, oh, I'm autistic, that's all the person knows. And it's one of the reasons why people don't disclose, because the nonsense you get back is like, oh, that must mean this, or that must mean, or you can't be autistic because of this. You don't know anything. You literally, all you know is that person's autistic. That's it. Sometimes people introduce me at conferences, so Luke's an expert on autism. No, I'm not. There is no such thing as an expert on autism. You logically, like statistically, you can't be, because you're always going to learn something new on every new autistic person you meet. And there are far too many of autistic people out there to know them all in depth. So you can't be an expert. You can have expertise in certain areas, 100%. That's not a problem. That sort of disclosure where people then believe they've got knowledge over you as a human being is actually nonsensical. But being autistic does lead to outcomes as you as a human being. So is it, if I'm saying it's not intrinsically just the being autistic that diametrically leads to, for example, an increased risk of being anxious or struggling in predominant neurotype social situation, or whatever it might be. That's where the equation came from. So autism plus environment equals outcome, not autism by itself. And if we accept that whatever the outcome is, well, I've mentioned anxiety. We know lots of autistic people are pathologically anxious, but you're not born an anxious autistic baby. So it's got to come from somewhere else. It doesn't come from being autistic. So autism plus environment equals anxiety. If that's the case, and we agree with my equation, which I think we should, because I think it's fairly simplistic, it's fairly obvious, and you can apply it to anybody, actually. If we're then going to accept, so fundamentally the equation works. Secondly, we can't change somebody being autistic. We've been through that already. So thirdly, the only thing, if we want to change the outcome, in this case anxiety, is to change the environment. And that's what we're really bad at doing. Usually it's like we need to change the kind of knee-jerk reactions. We need to change the person. Exactly what you were saying. They need fixing, they need curing, they need sorting out. Actually, forget about the autism, sort the environment out. All of a sudden, you've got a whole bunch of very happy, content autistic people.
Yes, which is, it loops back to what we were saying at the beginning, which is it comes down to accessibility and the term you were using of autistic courtesy, and actually thinking about, is this environment, or attempting to, because then I don't think you can ever make the perfect environment, but attempting to make environments that are as accessible as possible and being open to changing them as you learn more, because that's what it's about, isn't it? It's about the evolution of learning.
And I think sometimes it's actually fairly simple. Simple doesn't necessarily mean it's simplistic. So it might be simple fundamentally. That doesn't mean so it's easy to implement. But another one of my, it's not an equation this time. It's sort of, I don't know whether it's a mantra or whatever, but essentially, and this is almost a truism, but not quite. As I say, language matters. But the more options there are available in any given context, the less risk there is of discrimination, which I think it is almost a truism. Basically, if there's only one way of doing things, then that's going to suit some people better than others, in which case it's likely to be discriminatory. But if everything in life, from communication options, i.e., I don't know, I'll take a really obvious example, booking a GP appointment. Like, we're getting a little bit better, but so many GP appointments, you still need to use the phone. Like, if you are at a substantial disadvantage because you can't use the phone for whatever reason, you're too anxious to use the phone, you're at a substantial. If, on the other hand, there's a whole plethora of options as to how you can book an appointment, it doesn't cost very much, it takes a bit of effort. And once those communication systems are established, they're done, job done. Then all of a sudden, there's less risk of discrimination across the board. And that's just booking an appointment at a GP. But that goes for everything from applying to a university to completing a master's degree to taking an exam to having an interview at work, like everything. And we're very singular. It's very often like, this is the pathway. It goes back to what you were saying. This is the way things are done. This is what works for most people. Yeah, that's fine, but it doesn't work for other individuals who might be outside of that demographic curve, in which case it's potentially discriminatory. So actually, if we increase our options at any given stage of whatever it is we're doing, we're going to decrease risk of discrimination.
I find that really interesting, the example of booking a GP appointment, because if you follow that through and you think about how reports may be at some point furnished to say, oh, well, the outcomes for autistic people or other neurodiverse people might be worse in these areas like health or whatever. Well, actually, it's got nothing to do with the fact that anyone's autistic, that they've got worse health outcomes. But if there's obstacles in them seeking health care, of course their health outcomes are going to be worse. So they could draw these conclusions without actually really they're kind of missing the point in a way.
But just take that as an example. Like, that's a really, really, really good example. So we do know that health outcomes for autistic people, adults, are poorer, and that can't be because they're autistic. There's nothing health related that means autistic people are likely to die sooner than they should do. But if you, this is well, it's not even a hypothetical, this is based on very, very real people. You're autistic and you become ill. First of all, you're incredibly lacking in ego, and you're a very outward looking person. So you hate being in the spotlight. You absolutely hate, like, declaring to anybody else that actually you're real. So you're going to do everything you can to not go to the GP. The last time you went to the GP, you're very time orientated. Hypothetically, you like things to be done in a certain way. Your GP appointment was 11:15. You didn't get seen till 11:45. So that GP has already lied to you, essentially. They haven't kept up their side of the bargain. For that half an hour, you were in a room full of other people, which stressed you out because they were talking to each other and expecting you to engage. You've also had to go and queue up to talk to a receptionist and give them personal details that you weren't expecting. So you're completely thrown off. And then you go in, and because you're highly anxious, the GP has a very negative reaction, and they'll say, oh, you can't talk to me like that. And you need to kind of... So basically, you've already had an incredibly negative experience, which means that it's even less likely you're going to go to the doctors. So, and then you find out that you've got to make a phone call, and you hate using the phone because it causes you so much anxiety. This is incredibly real, right? Take all of that, put it to one side, and then you've got a GP, going back to autistic courtesy, you've got a GP surgery that recognises all of the potential issues. They do what I call a walkthrough. So you take a screencast, a video of you being a patient, but it's actually an actor or one of the GPs or whatever, going through an empty GP surgery. They look at their watch, say, look, it's 7 o'clock in the morning. This is our autism hour. And we can absolutely guarantee that whatever it is, every fortnight at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, if you make an appointment through our booking system, which you can do online, so you never have to speak to a person, then I can guarantee that I will be in room number 3. You don't need to go through a receptionist because we know who you are. I've already got your notes. You come straight through. I've got a walkthrough so you can see what it looks like. This is who I am. This is where I'm going to be sitting. I guarantee at 7 o'clock on the dot, you and I will be the only people in the GP surgery. There's a one-way system. So if anybody does come into the waiting room after you, you go through the one-way system. So you exit, you don't have to see anybody. None of that costs anything at all, apart from a bit of motivation. All of a sudden, you're potentially saving autistic people's lives.
Yeah, which is so significant. And it's such a different perspective to what exists at the moment, which is all about reinforcing conformity. You have to do it our way. You have to follow the process we've decided, but not for any real reason other than often power, actually. I think that's something we haven't talked about yet, which is an element to this, which is people wielding power and how that interferes with autonomy of people, not just autistic people, but of course it happens for neurodiverse people as well. I was curious, Luke, about what your thoughts are about the overlap in neurodiversity. Like, I am hearing a lot of people recently say, and I haven't gone to kind of check these figures out necessarily because I'm not somebody who often like dips into research because I'm not a big reader, but I've been hearing people say or throw around figures that like 70% of autistic people are likely to be ADHD. And I'm just wondering what your perspective is on the overlap between different neurotypes and neurodiversity with autism.
I think statistics can be very misleading because it depends on what you base them. Like, yes. If you say, are they based on individuals who we know have gone down the medical route of clinical diagnosis, which is obviously going to be different statistically to the reality of the individuals out there and everything in between. What I would say is if you are, in this case, autistic, then there's a much greater likelihood you would be neurodivergent in other ways as well. But that doesn't mean that you exclusively will be either. So you can be autistic and not be ADHD or dyslexic or dyspraxic or whatever. But there is a much greater chance of there being those kind of overlapping neurodivergences, which is interesting in and of itself. It's one of the things in research that is slightly problematic when people say, oh yeah, we took this group of autistic people and we came to this conclusion. It's like, yeah, but how many of those also were ADHD or whatever? So it's not clean research in that sense. That's why I think statistics and kind of like clickbait headlines and so on, you need to scratch beneath the surface. I'm really into the concept of what I call autistic epistemology, which is probably a whole nother day, but like, where does autism knowledge come from? Why is so much of it flawed? And yet why do we, as in society, still believe it? And then because of all of those things, what impact does that have on the real autistic population? And what do we need to do to change that? Because the repercussions for the autistic population tend to be incredibly negative if that autistic epistemology is flawed, which it often is.
I did some learning a few years ago, and what I picked up from that was that has been a turning point. I don't know if it was like in the last 15 years or the last 20 years, or the last decade, where a lot of academic research and people working in and around the topic of autism were identifying as autistic themselves or had family members who were identifying as being autistic, and that there was a real change in research and in perspective that came about because the lived experience seemed to all of a sudden be part of the narrative, rather than this kind of very academic focus that had been taken by non-autistic people previously. Is that something that you have noticed, a shift to that? Could that be one of the reasons why we're seeing this shift?
I think it depends on whether it's research that's funded as opposed to, say, doctoral study or research people are doing because they're interested in it without grants. So if you look at research in the broad autism field that is funded, it still doesn't align particularly well with the needs or wants of the autistic community. I think I'd feel fairly confident in saying that. Somebody might prove me wrong, but I think that's probably still the case. So there's still a lot of money, for example, in genetic research, in terms of behavioural research, in terms of interventions, those sorts of things. If you look at what the autistic community themselves are saying, that isn't necessary. They don't align very well. But there's definitely a growing area of research which is genuinely participatory and often autistic-led as well. Certainly, I almost exclusively now, when I'm examining PhD vivas, almost all of those are autistic students gaining their doctorates. Certainly in my course, I call it my course, so I'm the course leader, but certainly the courses at Hallam, the demographic has changed considerably over the last 20 years. So it used to be like lots of teachers coming on. Now, often we have more autistic students than non-autistic students in a cohort, which is gorgeous and just genuinely humbling, but brilliant to see. And some of those go on to do their own doctorates as well. So there's definitely a change in flavour within the research environment, but we're a hell of a long way away from where we need to be.
As a parting note on this, where do we need to be? What are you aiming for?
So I think it goes back to what I was saying about being fascinated by paradigmatic shifts in culture. I think that there needs to be a change in culture from understanding neurodivergence in the lens of something problematic and negative inherently, to totally accepting that level of authenticity and recognising, going back to what I thought as a 12-year-old, that actually this might be a brilliant way of doing things for a lot of people. That doesn't automatically mean that it's a good thing for everybody. And actually genuinely embracing that without thinking that you need to empathise with it. I'm heavily into empathy and the concept of empathy and the fact that it's okay not to be able to empathise with another person's life experience, as long as you don't invalidate it just because you don't share it. And I think, I don't know how to get there. I wish I knew. I don't know how to get there. But if there was that kind of paradigmatic shift in kind of cultural understanding of cognitive difference, then I think the world would be a much better place.
Me too. And I don't know how to get there either. And I want to have conversations like this because I think maybe that's part of the route. It's not going to be the thing that gets us there, but definitely raising people's awareness who maybe have never considered their own neurotype or others in the way that we've been talking about it today is helpful in creating that shift, even if in just a small way.
Well, thank you so much. Like, I cannot thank you enough for giving me the opportunity to have that say. It's much appreciated.
And thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. I haven't met you before, but like I said, when I reached out to you, I've been hearing great things about you from other people in the neurodiverse community that I've been learning with. So yeah, it's been great to get the opportunity to meet you. And yeah, now it's time to ask you what question you would like me to ask the next guest.
Okay, so pressure's on. It reminds me of, I was bizarrely on a radio station and they were doing like a thing about my life. And I wasn't stressed about that, but they said, you've got to pick one song. It was one of those things. And I was like, honestly, I spent days stressing over it. Like, what song am I supposed to pick? Anyway, so this is the only stressful thing about it. So if you're a future guest, and feel free to interpret this in any way you want, but say the most well-rounded person in the world was a cake. And they're like proper well-rounded, really good mental health, like absolutely, and they've got there. But along the journey to being a cake, they've had to be baked and they've had to be put together. What would be the one ingredient that is essential towards that well-rounded, well-being cake?
Very, very good question. I love that question. Great. So I'll ask that to the next guest, and then when we release that episode, I'll tag you somewhere so that you can hear their response.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Luke.
Thank you for listening. I'm curious about what this conversation has stimulated for you. Thoughts, feelings, curiosity. If this episode intrigued you, hit follow to be notified about new episodes. I know these conversations are valuable to me, and if you think they're valuable too, please do leave a review. Leaving a review allows more people to discover the podcast. You can scroll down to ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and click write a review. You can also connect with Becoming You on Instagram and TikTok by searching the handle at becoming_you__. The links are in the show notes too. You can also visit www.becomingyou.ie to explore the idea of becoming yourself. Thanks for tuning in. Bye for now.